Have you ever wondered if God wanted to speak to you? How would he do it? Not through a thundering voice from the sky, nor through miracles or strange omens. He chooses the nearest, simplest path, your own mind, where the smallest thoughts become the language of the divine. Carl Jung once said that among the countless noises in our heads, there is one voice that does not belong to fear, nor to the ego, but to the deepest part of the soul, the place that connects directly to God. But in today's world, we have forgotten how to listen. We seek him in churches, in rituals, in long prayers, forgetting that sometimes he is speaking through every thought, every fleeting intuition, every moment of silence we absent-mindedly ignore. In today's video, we will step into a journey that is both spiritual and deeply psychological. Did you know God can speak to you through your mind? Stop ignoring him. And when you learn to listen, everything in your life begins to change. Coincidences are no longer random. Pain is no longer meaningless. And silence becomes the language of the divine. Stay until the end of this video, and don't just listen with your ears, listen with your soul. This might be the first time you truly hear his voice. Number 1. The voice we mistake for the voice we mistake for our own. Have you ever been sitting quietly in the middle of an ordinary day, when suddenly a faint thought arises in your mind as if it doesn't belong to you? Yet it makes you pause, even brings you to tears. A reminder, an idea, or just a subtle urge. Call that person. Stop. Forgive. It's not loud, not commanding. It drifts through your mind like a gentle breeze, yet leaves behind a strange peace as if someone is speaking to you without words. Carl Jung called that the voice of the soul, where the deepest part of the human being tries to communicate with consciousness. When we think we are thinking, in truth the unconscious is speaking. He believed that within every human being there is a divine part connected to the whole, what religion calls God, and what he called the self, the center of the soul. It is there that the first whispers are born, not through sound, but through feeling. We often assume we control our thoughts. But Jung once warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Some thoughts do not come from logic, but from the deep unconscious, where the collective memory of humanity resides, where all souls intersect, and where God is still speaking. Think back. How many times have you had a feeling that something isn't right, and it turned out to be true? How many times were you about to do something, and a quiet voice said, "Don't," and you avoided trouble because of it? There are moments we can't explain. We can only feel, and in that feeling, the divine is present. A friend of mine once told me that she was on her way to work when suddenly a very soft voice in her mind said, "Turn back." She didn't know why, but the urge was so strong that she stopped the car and returned home. As soon as she opened the door, she saw the gas cylinder leaking. Just a few more minutes and the entire apartment could have caught fire. She said, "I knew someone was speaking to me." Sometimes God doesn't speak through miracles, doesn't send angels, doesn't appear in flames. He simply sends a tiny thought into your mind. And if you are still enough, you will hear it. Jung believed that human beings are not separate individuals, but part of a vast spiritual current where thoughts, emotions, and symbols are interconnected. When you are quiet enough, you begin to touch that current. Like a radio, you don't create the signal. You only need to tune to the right frequency. And the frequency of God is not found in noise or fear. It lies in the silence between two breaths. In the moment you release all attempts to control and simply sit still and feel, you will realize he was never silent. You just never truly listened. Someone once asked Jung, "Do you believe in God?" He smiled and replied, "I don't need to believe." I know that answer did not come from blind faith, but from direct experience of the soul, because he had heard that voice, not with his ears, but with his mind, not with reason, but with presence. And you can too. God does not choose perfect people to speak to. He speaks to those who dare to be still. You don't need to become a monk or a hermit. He can speak to you right in the middle of ordinary life while you're working, washing dishes, or simply breathing. A thought softly comes. Don't say that. It will hurt someone. A small voice says, "Forgive not for them, but for yourself." A faint intuition. Don't take this path today. Each time you follow, you are conversing with him. That is not superstition. It is communication between consciousness and the unconscious, between humanity and the divine within. Imagine your mind as the surface of the sea. On the surface, waves crash, winds blow, foam scatters. That is thought, worry, the noise of the world. But if you dive deep enough, beneath it lies absolute stillness. There all voices dissolve, leaving only the breath of the soul. And it is in that depth that God speaks not through words, but through presence. He doesn't need to shout for you to hear him. He only needs you to be silent enough to realize that the voice you're seeking out there is actually whispering within you. So the next time a thought makes you pause, fills you with peace or tears, don't dismiss it. Stay, listen, and know that perhaps it is the voice of God. When we can't hear God's voice, number two, when we can't hear God's voice, if God is still speaking, then why do most of us never hear him? What made his voice fade amidst the noise of the modern world? In our age, the hardest thing to find is not opportunity, but silence. Every day we wake up surrounded by hundreds of notifications, messages, deadlines, praise, and criticism. And in that whirlwind, we think we are living. But in truth, we are so filled up that there is no longer any space for the voice of the soul. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And perhaps the most terrifying thing is not that God is silent, but that we are no longer quiet enough to hear him. God never stops speaking. But today's human mind is like a room blasting dozens of speakers at once. Each sound is an echo of fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being enough, fear of being replaced. Each noise is a persona, the mask we wear to be loved and accepted. When we are too busy becoming the image others want to see, we lose the ability to hear ourselves. Think back to the last time you sat still without your phone, without music, doing nothing at all. You may have felt uncomfortable, even anxious, because in the silence the inner voices start to rise. What am I doing with my life? Am I truly happy? That is not random. That is the call of the soul. But most of us quickly cover our ears, open social media, and keep running. A viewer once shared that after losing her father, she buried herself in work. She worked 14 hours a day, attended conferences and parties, and on the surface she had everything: money, fame, beauty. But at night she felt an emptiness that nothing could fill. One day on the subway, she saw a homeless man reading an old Bible. He looked up, smiled, and asked, "When was the last time you listened?" That question haunted her for days. She began turning off her phone in the morning and sitting silently for 10 minutes. At first, her mind was chaotic, but gradually she noticed a faint stream of thought, not from reason, but carrying peace. One morning during meditation, she heard, "Call your mother." She did, and a few hours later her mother got into a minor accident. She arrived in time and saved her. Later she said, "I used to think God only spoke to special people, but he was always speaking. I was just too noisy to hear." That is what Jung meant by the persona, the social mask we wear to survive. It isn't evil, but if we forget who we are beneath it, we lose the ability to hear the truth from within. We confuse the applause of the world with the whisper of the soul. And paradoxically, the more successful we become in others' eyes, the further we drift from God's voice. I once heard a story about a woman who went to a priest and complained, "I pray all the time, but God never speaks to me." The priest smiled and said, "Have you ever been silent enough to let him speak?" That answer simple but piercing. God still speaks, but we are always thinking too much, doing too much. Jung believed that the connection with God does not lie in rituals, but in the moment a person pauses to converse with their soul. Sometimes silence is the language God loves most. He doesn't need explanation or logic. He only needs you to be present. As in Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." In stillness, you stop seeking God outside and begin recognizing him inside your own mind. Start small, 5 minutes every morning. No music, no phone, no plans. Just sit quietly and ask, "God, what do you want me to know today?" You might not hear anything right away, but if you are patient, one day in an ordinary moment, a thought will come and you'll know it wasn't from you. And before we move to the next part, ask yourself, how many times a day do I truly listen not to the world, but to my soul? If you've ever experienced that moment when silence suddenly became sacred, comment, "I heard God in the silence," because maybe he's waiting for you to hear him one more time. Number 3, the difference between God's voice and the ego's voice, God's voice and the ego's voice. And when you begin to hear that voice, soft, gentle, yet clear, another question arises. How do I know if it's God's voice and not my own? Because sometimes both come from within. Both sound familiar, but one brings peace, the other anxiety. One opens the heart, the other locks it in fear. That is why Jung emphasized, not every thought in your mind is truth. He distinguished between the ego, the self-image, and the self, the divine center of the soul. Both coexist, but only one speaks through light. The voice of the ego usually comes first, loudest and most logical. It says, be careful. Don't trust anyone. You must prove yourself. If you fail, everyone will laugh at you. But the voice of the soul comes later, light as breath. Do the right thing even when no one is watching. Forgive. Love without needing to win. Jung called this the eternal dialogue between the self and the whole. One side tries to control, the other only wants you to return. You can feel the difference not through logic but through energy in your body. When the ego speaks, you shrink. Your chest tightens. Your breath shortens. When the soul speaks, you expand. Your heart opens as if a small beam of light passes through your chest. I once heard a story of a woman named Daniela, a neurosurgeon. She said that during a surgery lasting over 10 hours, everything started to spiral out of control. Under pressure, her hands began to tremble. A harsh voice in her head shouted, "You're going to ruin everything. You're not good enough." She tried to ignore it, but the more anxious she became, the louder it grew. Then, in the middle of the chaos, another voice appeared, very soft. "Breathe. Trust your hands." Daniela paused, closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and in that moment, all tension vanished. Everything became clear. The surgery succeeded. When she told the story, she said, "I don't know who spoke to me, but I knew it wasn't me." That's the boundary Jung called the voice of the self, the voice from the center of the soul where God dwells in man. Jung didn't see God as a separate being, but as the supreme symbol of psychic order, the place where all fragments of the psyche unite. When you hear that voice, it's not that he's outside, it's that he's speaking through you. But the subtlety of this path lies here. The ego can imitate God's voice too. It knows how to make you believe you are being guided while it's only rationalizing your desires and fears. You can hear it in phrases like, "I must show them that God is with me," or "I'm sure this is my divine mission because I want it." But God's real voice never forces. It never rushes or demands. It only invites. In Greek mythology, there's the story of Odysseus and the sirens. Their song enchanted every sailor, the song of ego, of desire and illusion. Only Odysseus, tied firmly to the mast, could hear it without being destroyed. That is the symbol of the spiritual journey. You can't kill the ego, but you must recognize its voice and not let it steer the ship. Carl Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." When you begin to look within, you'll find two voices speaking at once, one fearful and calculating, the other gentle and wise. Spiritual maturity is learning to know who is speaking. Perhaps this is the most subtle challenge of human life, to discern between God's voice and the ego's. Because the ego is clever, it disguises itself with faith, morality, even spiritual ideals. It makes us believe we are enlightened when in truth we are led by the need to prove ourselves. But God's voice never makes you proud. It makes you peaceful. If you want to know who is speaking in your mind, don't ask what is it saying. Ask, how does it make me feel? The ego speaks to control. The soul speaks to free. And maybe that's why God chose to speak through your mind, because it's the meeting point between soul and world. But only in stillness can you know who's speaking within you, God, or your own fear. When God speaks through symbols, number 4, when God speaks through symbols. After learning to distinguish between God's voice and the ego's, you'll realize that sometimes he doesn't speak in words at all, because words belong to the language of the mind, while God often speaks in the language of symbols, coincidences, and events that seem random but hold uncanny meaning. Carl Jung called this synchronicity meaningful coincidence when outer events mirror the inner state of the soul. Jung believed that the unconscious doesn't exist only within the individual, but also within the collective unconscious, where all souls are connected through archetypal symbols. And it is at this intersection that God speaks, not through sound, but through meaning. A recurring dream, a number appearing again and again, a song playing at the exact moment of confusion. All are his way of whispering, "I am here." In a Jungian therapy session, I once met a woman named Maria, an artist from Spain. After a devastating heartbreak, she lost her faith in life. One night she dreamed she was lost in a dark forest when a white owl flew past her. The next morning, scrolling through her phone, she saw an artwork suggested on Instagram, the exact same white owl. She found it strange but ignored it. The next day, while heading home, a bus passed by with a giant picture of a white owl printed on it. That evening, she received an email from a gallery inviting her to join an exhibition titled "The Owl of Transformation." Maria burst into tears. She said, "I realize God didn't tell me to paint again. He sent a symbol, and when I was quiet enough to notice, I knew he was saying live again." Jung taught that symbols are the language of the soul beyond logic. Modern people believe only what's rational deserves trust. But spirituality doesn't operate through linear reasoning. Dreams, art, coincidence, and intuition. These are the grammar of God. Synchronicity is not a miracle, but a sign. Like when you're struggling with a decision, and suddenly a line on a billboard or a song lyric says exactly what you needed to hear. Science calls it pattern recognition, the brain's tendency to seek meaning. But Jung added that when the soul longs deeply for something, the universe mirrors it back. He wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." And indeed, people with rich inner lives experience synchronicity more often, not because they are superstitious, but because they are awake. They observe, feel, and notice the hidden threads woven through everyday life. A beautiful metaphor for this lies in the story of Joseph in the Bible. Betrayed, sold into slavery, imprisoned. Yet he trusted that an invisible hand was weaving everything together. Years later, he became ruler of Egypt, saving those who had once wronged him. Looking back, Joseph said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." A perfect example of synchronicity. Everything happening in the right way at the right time, guiding the soul home. Moments like that are when the unconscious and the outer world merge. When meaning transcends the boundary between spirit and matter. When we live unaware of these symbols, life feels random, fragmented. But when we awaken, every small detail, a feather on the road, a stranger's glance, a passing phrase, becomes sacred language. God doesn't need thunder to speak. He only needs you to look closer. So when you notice repeating signs, don't dismiss them. Pause and ask, what does this mean? Not every coincidence is God's voice, but every voice of God comes through synchronicity. It arrives exactly when you need it, in the way you can understand, and at the depth your soul is ready for. So next time a symbol repeats itself, when you see the same message from different sources, or when your heart quietly trembles at a small sign, don't ignore it. It may be His whisper sent from the depths of the unconscious, where your mind and God meet not through sound, but through meaning. Have you ever experienced a coincidence that gave you chills, as if someone was orchestrating everything behind the scenes? A recurring dream, a number, a phrase, a stranger's words, and your heart knows. This isn't random. This is a message. Share that moment in the comments. The time the universe sent you a secret code, a message only you could understand. Maybe your story will touch someone lost and become the sign they've been waiting for. When suffering becomes the soul's calling. Number 5. When suffering becomes the soul's calling. There are times in life when you don't hear God in prayer, don't see any signs in dreams, only emptiness. You wake up unmotivated. Things that once brought joy now feel distant. You think you're falling apart, but sometimes in that very moment, God is speaking. Not through words, but by quieting all the noise in your life. He doesn't take your joy. He removes what hides His voice. Carl Jung called this the pain of awakening. He said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. When the soul prepares to enter a new level of awareness, it must break the old structures, beliefs, identities, roles you've clung to. Just like a seed must crack open to sprout, pain is the sign of being born again. Because in truth, pain doesn't only wound, it empties. And in that emptiness, the divine can enter. When belief systems collapse, when the mind has nothing left to cling to, you're forced to turn inward where the soul patiently waits. Jung called this the moment of center shift. When one stops living from the outer ego and begins living from the inner essence. What you thought was the end is the beginning of deeper existence, where silence becomes prayer and suffering becomes the doorway to grace. I recall the story of a university professor who was suspended after a small administrative mistake. She lost her job, her reputation shattered, and for months she fell into despair. One night, in her darkest moment, she dreamed she was in a dark room holding a candle. When the flame went out, a voice said, "The light doesn't come from the candle, but from you." She awoke filled with a strange peace. She later said, "I realized I had lived my whole life seeking recognition to be seen as capable and respectable. But when everything fell apart, I saw that God hadn't taken anything from me. He only removed what blocked me from myself." She returned to teaching, but this time she no longer tried to be perfect. She taught about spirituality, about listening to the soul. She said, "I no longer pray for God to save me. I ask, what is He trying to teach me through this pain?" Pain, in Jung's view, is God's secret language. When what you think you need most is taken, the soul says you've been relying on the wrong source. God doesn't punish, He liberates. And sometimes that begins with destruction. Jung wrote that every spiritual crisis is an invitation from the unconscious to reconnect with the divine center. Pain doesn't destroy the soul, it destroys the ego. When the ego cracks, the mind opens, and in that opening, God's voice can be heard. Modern neuroscience sees something similar. After major loss or trauma, the brain reorganizes its neural networks. It rebuilds itself. In other words, after every deep suffering, both brain and soul restructure toward greater compassion and awareness. Pain is how the soul grows. Like metal refined in fire, the soul becomes clear through trials. God doesn't want us to suffer, but He knows that sometimes only suffering makes us willing to listen. If the previous section was about recognizing His signs through symbols and coincidences, this one reminds you that when everything seems to collapse, listen harder because maybe it's not an ending, but a call. My child, return to me. So if you're in pain today, don't rush to conclude that God is silent. Maybe He's just speaking another language, the language of breaking. And while you think you're losing everything, you're actually being taught to hear with your heart. Let every crack in you become where light enters. For sometimes God's voice doesn't come from heaven. It echoes from where you're broken. Number 6, listening by living. In listening by living truth, God doesn't only speak in sacred moments, in dreams or coincidences. He speaks through your everyday actions, through how you face life. Jung once wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." In other words, the way you live is your answer to God. Hearing God's voice isn't a skill, it's a way of living. Every time you're honest with yourself, forgive without being asked, or choose love over judgment, you're listening to Him. Every time you say no to what no longer aligns with your soul, even if it disappoints others, you're honoring that divine dialogue. Because God doesn't speak for you to hear, He speaks for you to live differently. Carl Jung believed true consciousness forms only when one begins to live according to their inner knowing. You can read 1,000 spiritual books, meditate for hours, but if you keep betraying your soul in daily life, pretending to be fine when you're not, pleasing others when your heart resists, then you haven't truly listened. I once met a woman named Mary Ann, an interior designer in Los Angeles. For years she followed the perfect plan: successful husband, beautiful home, thriving career. Yet every morning when she looked at the mirror, she saw an exhaustion she couldn't name. "I pray every day," she said, "but I never hear God." One day at church, she sat in silence. No voice came, only a small thought. If you no longer believe in this life, start again with what makes you feel alive. The next day, she quit her job, moved back to her hometown, and started painting. Her friends asked, "Are you crazy?" She smiled. "I'm just listening." Years later, her paintings were exhibited internationally. But she said, "What matters isn't that they sold. It's that I came back to life again." When your actions reflect what your soul knows is right, you no longer need to seek God's voice. You become that voice because God doesn't speak through promises, but through action. When you choose honesty, even if it costs you comfort, when you choose compassion instead of anger, He is speaking through you. That's why Jung believed listening is not just a meditative state, but a way of being. A truly listening person doesn't need to declare their faith. It radiates from their gestures, their eyes, the way they move through the world without losing their inner stillness. Think of it like a piano. If the soul isn't tuned, no matter how skilled the musician, the sound will distort. But when your soul aligns with the divine, when thought, emotion, and action vibrate at the same frequency, life begins to play like a melody that God Himself performs. You stop seeking Him because every note you live, every breath you take already is Him. In history, one woman embodied this truth through her way of living: Mother Teresa. She didn't preach God through grand speeches, but through service, tending to the dying, washing the forgotten, loving the unloved. When asked, "Do you hear God speak to you?" she smiled. "I hear Him in every person I touch." She didn't wait for signs from heaven. She became the sign, and that is what Jung meant by the self, the divine essence within each person where God and human meet in action. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Once you understand that listening is no longer about hearing something external, it's about living every moment in rhythm with Him, then you'll see God never left. He's always been here. So if you're still searching for His voice, don't just look up to the sky. Look into your life, into every small act, every daily choice. If you live with presence, honesty, and compassion, you're not just hearing Him. You're letting Him live through you. And then you'll realize God doesn't just speak to you. He sings through your very life. If this video made you slow down, listen deeper, and let your every act become a gentle response to the divine. Click like as a sign that you've heard the call. Because perhaps even this small click today is your way of saying to God, "I am ready to listen." Number 7. When you become his channel, when a person truly listens, they no longer need to prove their faith. They simply are. And in that presence, those around them feel peace without a single sermon. Remember, God doesn't need perfect people. He needs willing souls. What makes you his channel isn't holiness, but openness. He speaks through the humble, through those who no longer hide behind the ego, but dare to live in love. And you'll notice when your soul opens, everything begins to align. You meet the right people at the right time for the right purpose. You no longer force things to happen because they start flowing through you, like a river that doesn't strive to move yet nourishes the forest. You become that river where God's will moves through human form. This is the moment Jung called union with the self. It's not that you disappear, but that you expand beyond the borders of the ego. You no longer serve God as something separate. You become the service itself. I once heard of a nurse who worked in a hospital. She said that at first the job drained her. Every day I watched someone die. I prayed for strength, but I never heard anything. One day as she sat beside a dying old man, he held her hand and said, "You don't need to say a word. When you're here, I feel peace." She said, "I didn't hear God, but I realized maybe he was speaking through me." From that day, she stopped praying to hear him. She just lived with love, patience, and presence. Strangely, each day she began to feel guided not by logic, but by a quiet strength in her heart. Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Perhaps it is also the most sacred, because when you accept yourself fully, no longer dividing me from him, you become the instrument God can play." Neuroscience confirms this resonance. When people live in love, empathy, and presence, their brains synchronize with others. Meaning, when one soul touches its own depth, it can literally tune the energy of those around it. Love and awareness become contagious, a divine resonance, just as Jung described. This is mirrored in the figure of the Virgin Mary, who didn't preach, didn't seek power, but simply said, "Let thy will be done through me." That surrender wasn't weakness. It was the deepest strength of the soul. When you stop resisting, stop controlling, and let his current move through you, you become the vessel through which love takes human form. Jung believed wholeness isn't about banishing darkness, but integrating it, letting both light and shadow serve one truth. When you stop rejecting your imperfect parts, God can use those very cracks to shine his light, because light only enters where the heart is broken. A beautiful image of this state is the candle. When lit, it doesn't try to shine. It simply is, and in being itself, it dispels darkness. Likewise, you don't need to convince anyone to believe in God. Just be the candle in the night, and whoever stands near you will see the light. At that stage, you no longer pray, "Lord, speak to me," but whisper, "Please speak through me," because you understand his voice was never far. It's just been waiting for a place to echo, and that place is the human heart. So if you've made it this far on the journey, remember, God isn't only speaking to you through your mind. He's trying to speak to the world through you. Let him let your life become a living prayer, so that when others look at you, they don't just see a person, they see a glimpse of the divine. And then you'll understand Jung's words. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. At that moment, you no longer just hear his voice. You are his voice in human form. Conclusion. Maybe you once believed you had to retreat from the world, pray for hours, or reach some special spiritual state to hear God. But Jung would smile and say, "You don't need to go anywhere. He's been with you long before you began to search. God doesn't speak through thunder, but through subtle intuition. Not through miracles, but through the small thoughts you often dismiss. When you are silent, when you live truthfully, when you choose love over fear, he is speaking through you. Every intuition, every coincidence, every pain is part of that ongoing conversation. So if today your mind suddenly feels calm, or a quiet thought brings peace to your heart, know this: it's not random. Perhaps he's whispering, "I'm still here, still guiding you." And if this video made you pause and listen more deeply, share it with someone who needs that same call. Subscribe, because this journey will continue, not for you to find God, but to realize he never left. Let every thought you live, every action you choose, be a gentle answer sent back to him.